Especially since we have with us what I would call a colossus within the Islamic education sector, our Honorable Sheikh Dr. Abu Amina Bilaal Phillips, who is with us as a guest in South Africa. And I would call him a colossus in education in the sense that he has striven throughout his life. He has a history of educators in his family, he himself being an educator, and having had education very close to his heart, and to see that it is a way in which the Ummah could be bettered. So I'm going to say that basically, from that perspective, I'm going to allow Sheikh Bilaal to actually take the floor in terms of introducing his perspective and his methodology for us. In terms of the just sort of from my perspective, what I wanted to do is a kind of a background on decoloniality, and the way I see it, it's a very, I would say, misunderstood sometimes problem across most of the campuses, even with the Fees Must Fall movement. We find diverse opinions, and even in one or two sittings, I'll share with you from the faculty which I am part of at this university. We had a presentation done by one of the faculty members which talked about decolonization, recurriculation, changing the curriculum to reflect more indigenization of knowledge and so forth, for a good hour, only to be followed up by another person from the international office which talked about globalization, bringing more European perspective in, having more ties with international universities, internationalizing the curriculum and so forth. So in one session you could have people having diverse opinions, and this just illustrates how little this has been in fact understood, perhaps sometimes from the educational side as well. But of course, from the student side, Yasin Kipi introduced the topic fairly well, from a Muslim perspective, how that should be seen, especially within the context of the ethics and the ethical way in which this is dealt with. So here we are in Cape Town, the Fair Cape, which I say was a product of colonization. When Jan van Riebeeck landed here at the behest of the Dutch, it was the rise of a new world politic for Africa. Africa has been colonized before, the Greek ruins in Alexandria being an example of it. Ptolemy VI, Cleopatra, they were all Greek. The Romans came afterwards and established their dominion across North Africa. We have amphitheaters all the way from Egypt to Morocco through Tripoli and so forth. The Romans were there. But it was the colonization of corporations, something which Yasin Kipi touched on when he said that when the Western European countries colonized the world, the colonization of corporations is what I call it. Patrician businessmen using governmental kingdoms as a leverage because of the great financial power that they wielded. And this was in fact the modern era. When Jan van Riebeeck came here, he didn't come at the behest of an Alexander, at the behest of a Caesar. He came at the behest of a corporation, 17 directors, what we call in Afrikaans the year is 17, the 17 lords, the patricians. These were businessmen who funded and empowered the what they saw as not political opportunity, but financial or business opportunity in conquering resources and mineral-rich places across the earth. At that time, it was spice. So this was followed up with the British East India Company. And so we see at the behest of the modern colonization period, although governments were involved, although flags of various countries were hoisted, the exploitation nature was far worse. And this is in fact what we've inherited, and in fact this is where we need to move forward from. So of course, with the Fees Must Fall movement, we saw quite a number of problems arise in terms of how Muslims would take this forward, or how Muslims should take this forward. And of course, if we go with the Fanonian, what one can call the Fanonian view on this, he's quite clear. He basically states that this can only be, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. Now, we would tend to differ with that and say that it does not have to be. And it does not necessarily mean that we have to reduce everything to a kind of tabula rasa. We have to build on something, and our way forward is, of course, education. If we can cross that bridge in educating with the correct fortitude, of course, we will be able to build a society that can understand the situation or the problems that we face, where we come from, and also where we can go to. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our guest and our honored speaker.
رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. From my perspective, from an Islamic perspective, building on what my brother Yasin laid down, and unfortunately we didn't get here in time to hear your introduction, but along the same vein, from the Islamic perspective, the globalization or secularization of education has created a phenomenon in the Muslim world today where our graduates are not serving the Ummah, where the goal, as Brother Yasin was pointing out, the goal being merely financial, it has created a generation of unscrupulousness which perpetuates the corruption that exists in our societies all around the world, making us the majority of the top 10 most corrupted countries in the world, according to the UNESCO list, when that has never been historically our reputation. Islam spread in Indonesia, Malaysia, without any violence, any soldiers. It spread through trade. Through trade from an Islamic perspective, free from deception, which touched the hearts of those who they had been trading with for 1,000 years before. Those people in Indonesia recognized the difference, that sudden change in the method of trade, and that opened their hearts to Islam, making Indonesia the largest Muslim country in the world. That is our history. The reality today, where Muslims are trained in secular institutions here in South Africa, where the secular ideas and ideals are subtly placed in their minds, so they graduate effective tools for the system, but their connection with the ummah and their responsibilities to the Muslim community are neutralized. However, this problem begins not at university level, but it begins from kindergarten. This is where it begins. There needs to be a new approach for Muslims in their educational institutions to produce the kind of student graduate from high school with a consciousness who could enter the halls of such secular institutions and take the best and leave the rest. This is what we should have. And ultimately, to create our own institutions that would be exemplary to the rest of the society, we should have institutions, tertiary institutions, which people would be scrambling to enter because of the quality of graduates that it produces. Rounded graduates. So, where do we go from here? I believe that we have to reconsider what constitutes the Islamic school. Right now, the Islamic school is one which teaches modern subjects, we could call them secular subjects. 80% of the time, students spend with the secular subjects, and 20 or 15 or 10% of the time, they spend with the Islamic subjects. Those Islamic subjects, whether Quran, Arabic, or Islamic studies, are what we believe makes this school an Islamic school. But this is a wrong conception. This is part of the Western tradition of leaving to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and unto God what belongs to God. That separation between the religious and the secular world. That division has been used by Western civilization, and the secular has expanded to the point where it now dominates all of the systems. The religious is left to individuals. You can believe whatever you want, but what's going to happen in terms of governance, in terms of education, and all the other functions of the society should be secular. From the Islamic perspective, that secular approach has removed morality from the classroom. There is no place for morality. And our task as a community should fundamentally be to bring morality back into the classroom. It needs to be there. Otherwise, the system will produce monsters like what we have recently in Florida, mass shootings by high school, junior high school students across America. The leader, the example for secularized educational systems. So much so that that massacre which took place was the 18th, 18th massacre since January. The 18th massacre since January. School massacre since January. There are so many of them happening, they're not even reported except occasionally. There were hundreds last year, 200 and something of them. So what's happening? This phenomenon began in the 80s, the first Columbine massacre, and followed by others, and it just kept adding up until we have reached this state. Before that, it was unheard of. And it's unthinkable how a student can come into a school and just start shooting down, killing former classmates, innocents within the school system. It's unthinkable. But it is the same background which created monsters from the American troops that went into Afghanistan, that went into Iraq, went into these different locations in the Muslim world and committed atrocities, unthinkable atrocities. People who were ready to say, I didn't consider these people to be human beings. They're animals. So I could do anything to the animals that I felt like. It's a mentality that has been created by a system in which morality has been eliminated. So our approach needs to be the reintegration of Islamic knowledge, practice into the educational system. That the real challenge for us is not to add Islamic studies in the school, but to Islamize what is being taught the majority of the time in order to produce that ideal student that we seek to produce. Because the Islamic Studies department, spending 10 to 15% of the time with the students, cannot compete with the other subjects, especially when people's futures are depending on those other subjects. So it's a losing battle. Not to mention that the Islamic subjects, for the most part, are taught by unqualified teachers who don't know how to teach. We're not trained in the art of teaching, which leads the majority of schools to be in a situation where the most hated subject among the students of our Islamic schools, the most hated subject is Quran. And this is global. You can do, those of you from the field of education, make that a project. Go to the local Islamic schools. Have a questionnaire and find out what is the favorite subject of the students and what are the most hated subjects. I guarantee you, inshallah, you will find that the Quran, Arabic, and Islamic studies are the most hated subjects in general. Mainly because our teachers are unqualified. You are an Arab, you lived in the Arabic world, come teach Arabic. You graduated from an Islamic institution, Darul Uloom or Medina or Azhar, come teach Islamic studies. Well, you're never taught before. You're not a teacher. You've not been trained in teaching methodology. So what's going to happen in your classroom? What happens is what I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, have experienced. So that needs to be corrected on one hand. That the same way that when we hire a teacher to teach English, we don't say, oh, you lived in Canada for a while. Oh, you speak nice. Your English is nice. Okay, come teach English. No, we're not going to hire you on that basis. We're going to say, do you have qualifications? Are you an English teacher? Did you graduate in English? You had so and so and so and so. That's who we want to teach. The same criterion that we hold for the teachers of the quote-unquote secular subjects, we should hold those same criterion for the Islamic subject. No difference. No difference. Because the skill of teaching is not something which people are born with. It's something we learn. You may have an inclination towards it, but without learning it properly, you will not be able to do it effectively. Maybe after time, trial and error, you eventually stumble on a methodology which works somewhat. But that's not the way it's supposed to be, not in our times. So we have that side that we have to deal with. But then the other side, the secular subjects, these subjects need to be taught from an Islamic perspective. On one hand, the teaching of whatever we give our children in kindergarten, that teaching, as well as what is taught in the early primary levels, is to a large degree done through stories and images, pictures and stories. What we need to make sure in the classroom is that the environment of the classroom should be Islamic. That every picture we put on the wall in the classroom, it serves an Islamic purpose. It promotes an Islamic thought. Because that's the environment of the young children. And as is said and attributed to philosophers from China, one picture speaks 1,000 words. So, for example, when you are teaching to the small children body parts, there's standard pictures which have been created and sold in educational stores or whatever that sell, retail stores that sell the educational equipment, teaching aids, etc. There's a standard picture of a little boy whose hands are away from his body, like that, standing, and he's in bikini underwear. We might say it's just a little kid. Does he really have aura? Private parts that should not be shown? Does it count? Well, it's not against him. It's not counted against him. But there is a message being taught. You are supposed to teach the young people a sense of shyness. That undermines those teachings. So your Islamic art department should modify that picture so at least the basic aura is covered. Navel to knee should be covered. And put an Islamic cap on his head, just to, not to say that you have to wear a cap, but just to send a message here. Oh, he's a little Muslim boy. The students connect. There's a connection there. And of course, in the Islamic school, when I gave a workshop on Islamization of curriculum and lesson plans in one of your local schools here recently, a couple of days back, when I asked them, do you have an Islamic art department? They said, no. That was canceled. No Islamic art department. Hey, art is a part of life. Yes, artwork can misguide people, promote corruption, all these other things, but artwork can also promote wholesome thinking, practice, etc. It's a two-edged sword. That we need that department in the Islamic schools to be able to provide the necessary imagery and to train the students who have that inclination in the right direction. It's needed, you know. Simply because we don't want the haram, we don't cancel that whole field of study. And also, even on the earliest of levels, we can connect our students with the history of Islamic contributions to world global civilization. Because this is what has happened in the colonization of the textbooks. Muslim contributions to world civilizations have been erased. Not there, not found. So if you ask the average student who graduates, grade 12, do you know who Sir Isaac Newton was? Immediately, he will tell you, oh, it's the guy who sat under a tree and an apple hit him on the head and he started to think about gravity. Yeah. Right? Yes. And who was Albert Einstein? Oh, he was the guy who gave the formula E equals mc squared to split the atom, blah, 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 blah. Okay, yeah. And then you ask them, and do you know who Al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham was? Oh, who's he? A football player? Like Zainuddin Zaidan? Is he one of those? Playing with Barcelona, or is he? No idea. Blank. And you could mention name after name after name, and they would just be blanked out. They have no idea who these colossal geniuses, inventors, scientists of the past were. No idea. So they're cut off from that world. A world which represents our background, which gives us a sense of place. We are a part of a continuum. We're not people who are just discovering knowledge. All the knowledge came from Greece and Rome, Europe. So they are the ones to be idealized. We look at them as being the top, they're the best, they're the ones, they have all the knowledge. We're just under them picking up the pieces. So we have to, how do we change that? We have to connect the students with the past, with Muslim contributions. not just to glorify and be happy about, but to feel that we have a place in history. That Islam is relevant to today, because the foundations for the computer were developed by Muslim scientists 500 years ago, 800 years ago. They laid down the foundations. So, reconnect the students. Thirdly, we need to bring in to every class a verse from the Quran, or a piece of a verse from the Quran. Connect the students with Quran. Let them understand that the Quran is relevant. It has something to say about everything. There's no topic you can talk about that Quran cannot be connected somehow, some way. So that's what we need to have them understand, that the Quran is relevant. Relevant to today, to this world now. When the secular world is saying, no, the Quran is irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant. Even our greatest documents, the American Constitution, only 300 years back, the Magna Carta, UK, even older, France, after the French Revolution, they set up their own documents. European documents. Those documents contain travesties of injustice. They contain concepts that are totally rejected by society today. No fraternity and brotherhood, etc. People being equal, etc., etc. None of that's there. Instead, what you find in the American Constitution, in the first article, that non-white people, coloreds, are equivalent to 3/5 of a white person. That is the definitive document, the creation of the United States of America, and that was what it was built on. Non-white people are equivalent to 3/5 of a white person. You can make it a research to find out how they got to 3/5 instead of 4/5 or 2/5. Interesting. Anyway, if those documents are only 300 years old, 400 years old, and they're messed up, what about this book of yours 1,400 years ago? That must be even worse. 100 times worse. That's their logic. And we can understand their thinking. That if their own documents, because they look at the Quran as being Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's writings, he wrote it, because they're not accepting that it's revelation from God. So it's Muhammad ﷺ wrote that, and their forefathers wrote what they wrote, and this guy is 1,000 years before them, and surely he must have made way more mistakes than them, because society is evolving, getting better and better and better, till where we have reached today, supposedly. So we need to counter that narrative. We need, in our educational system, to reconnect students with the Quran, the foundation of Islam. That reconnection is a massive step where our communities have become disconnected, where the Quran is a book of barakah. It's used for barakah, for blessing, for everything else but guidance. Even though Allah said, describing the Quran, in the second chapter, second verse, Hudan lil muttaqeen. Guidance for those who fear Allah. In spite of that, we are using the Quran for everything but guidance, in the real sense. I remember having some students in Dubai when I taught at the Islamic Information Center, which I set up in Dubai, first Islamic center, Dawah center in the UAE. I had some students who were from different parts of the Muslim world. There were two young ladies in the class. One's name was Naml, and the other one's name was Nahl. Naml means ant, and Nahl means bee. One was called ant, and the other one was bee. So I was amazed. I said, where did you get these names from? Who gave you these names? They said, well, our father, he just opened the Quran and he put his finger in, and whatever his finger fell on, that became our name. This is what the Quran had become. And then I began to understand why I came across people whose names were Subhanallah, Bismillah. Where did these names come from? It's this approach to the Quran. Or people read the Quran, we know, in Taraweeh, in Ramadan, we go through the whole Quran. But what did we understand of the Quran in Taraweeh? We were struggling to stay awake. You're hoping the Imam will hurry up and finish, get to that witr and can get home. Or we read it in Arabic during the daylight hours or whatever of Ramadan, and we don't understand a word of what we've read. Or in the beginning of our events, etc., we have a qari read verses from the Quran. Everybody sits silently, listening, appreciating, but not understanding a word of what he's reading. So what are we appreciating? His voice. And we all have our favorite qaris, Abdul Basit, Al-Husri, Minshawi in the old days. Now we have others in our time. So it becomes like Top of the Pops. People are listening to the melodious voices of the qari, enjoying and appreciating those melodious voices. And it's not to say it shouldn't be melodious, because the Prophet ﷺ did say, "Man lam yataghanna bil Quran falaysa minna." Whoever does not sing the Quran, beautify the Quran with their voices, is not of us. So it is. But for us, the listeners, our focus should be on understanding. Or the readers, we're reading the Quran. Better for us in Ramadan to read a portion of the Quran along with the tafsir and have understood what Allah is saying, taken something from it that we can live by, we can act on, rather than struggling to read the whole Quran and not understand a single word. This is the disconnection with the Quran. This is Hajr al-Quran that Allah speaks about. So, how do we turn that around? We have to realize, on one hand, that the Quran is relevant to our lives, we need to understand it because we need to live by it. It is the foundation of Islam. In the classroom, we're teaching a course on seas, waters, etc. We bring maraj al-bahrayni yaltaqiyan. The two seas come together. Quran speaks about seas. Just that little piece. We don't need the whole surah. Just the piece to show to the students the Quran has spoken about seas. Make that connection. Quran is relevant. So whatever we're dealing with, we bring an ayah or a portion of an ayah which is relevant to the topic. And of course, in our general gatherings, whenever we're having them, we have a qari who's going to recite some Quran before we start, which is not really from the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ didn't do it. But it's not haram. We can do it to help people connect more with the Quran. But after we read the Arabic, then read the English translation. So everybody has understood what was read. The goal of guidance has been made achievable, that those verses would guide them. Similarly, we should add in the curriculum hadith, where possible. Now, to say that we can find a hadith for every subject, for every class, maybe we can't. Quran, more so. Hadith, a bit more difficult. But still, much of what we're teaching, we can find hadiths relevant to. We're talking about the secular subjects here now, so-called secular subjects. So, we do the same. Take a portion of the hadith, just enough for them to understand what the Prophet ﷺ had to say is also relevant to us. The Sunnah is relevant because we have a movement out there where it says Sunnah is irrelevant. It's filled with mistakes. It's stories which are passed down generation after generation orally, and people forgot. And just as if I were to tell a story to sister here, she tells it to the next sister, story. Go around the classroom, and then we have the last person here tell that story. You know what that's going to sound like. I'm sure you all had that done in a classroom sometime. It's a joke, everybody laughs. What I said was a million miles away from what the last person repeats. So, hey, how can you trust hadith? Ignorance, of course, of the science of hadith and how hadith were compiled and narrated, etc. Not understanding that from the very first generation in the time of the Sahaba, hadiths were being written down also. That haddathana doesn't just mean speaking purely from memory, but also from written material, etc. That knowledge isn't there. So hadith have become sidelined. People take out some hadiths, like the hadith of the fly, which says, if a fly falls in your drink, dunk him in, throw him out, and drink. Because under one wing is disease, and under the other wing is a cure. Let's look at that. Medical profession tells us that the flies are a source of disease. Do we have anybody saying that the flies are a source of cure? No. So this is wrong. So either you say the Prophet ﷺ was wrong, he gave false information, or you say the hadith is just not reliable. These are things which are inaccurately conveyed and got mumbled, jumbled, till we have what we have. That's the line that's being promoted by the Quraniyun. Those who say, we'll only follow the Quran. As the Prophet ﷺ had said in Sunan Abi Dawood, that there would come a time when a man will lie on a couch and hold the Quran in his hand and say, what I find in here halal, I make halal. What I find haram, I make haram. Anything outside of that doesn't count. We have them today. Rejecting hadith. And reality is that once you reject hadith, you have pulled the rug out under Islam. Because who narrated the Quran to us? The same people who narrated the hadith. So if you say that what they narrated of hadith became distorted, etc., then you end up with the Quran having the same accusation. And the Quranic verses, who interprets them? Because that's what the role of the Prophet ﷺ was. وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. That's what Allah said. I've revealed to you, Muhammad ﷺ, the reminder, the Quran, in order that you would explain to the people what was revealed for them. That was his job. So when Allah said establish the prayer, then how do we establish it? How do we make it? If you're not going to accept hadith, you could start the prayer from sitting. Then you stand up. Then you prostrate. It's possible. You can make another version. You can come up with any combination you want. Because the Quran does not specify the order of the prayer. It is the Sunnah which tells us you start from standing, clasping your hands, reciting, bowing, prostrating, sitting. It is the Sunnah which tells us that. Once you cancel out the hadith, the Sunnah, then the Quran becomes open to anyone's interpretation. Anyone can come up and say this means that and that means the other and so and so and so. Free interpretation. So it is necessary for the students to have that sense of importance in their minds of the Sunnah, the Hadith, the Sunnah. Hadith which carries the Sunnah for us. And finally, in each and every class, we should have a moral message given. Moral message which may be relevant to the material that is being covered in the class, whatever the subject is. Some moral principle should be passed on. So that at the end of the day, after 12 years of study, the student who has been exposed in this fashion will be completely different from any student we know today. He will have a moral sense that we don't have among our students today. The school I visited a couple of days back, I asked them, and there were, I think, a few hundred males and females, maybe around 300 senior students. I asked them, who among you, considering yourselves to be Muslim students, who among you can raise his or her hand and say, Wallahi, I have never cheated in any test or examination? And I won't ask you guys here that now, so as not to embarrass you, but in that group of hundreds, we saw about 5 hands among the girls and 2 hands among the boys. So that is the product. And that's one of the better schools, whose owners, etc., are Islamically minded, they want to do it Islamically, but they missed the boat. They were relying on Quran, Arabic, and Islamic studies, which the students spend only 10% of the curriculum time with, to save them and to produce examples for the community. They failed. The school failed. They didn't achieve the goal. And as I asked them, considering that corruption, Zuma and the others, corruption problems which exist in the country today, which everybody is talking about from one angle or another, if they remove those in governance and replace them with you, would it be any different? They all admitted it wouldn't. We would end up doing the same thing. So then how do you change society? You can't change society with students who achieve their degrees by cheating. They're dishonest. They're corrupt all the way through school. Then what are they going to do when they get in the positions of authority? But be corrupt further. So this is the challenge which faces us. Faces society as a whole. Maybe the rest of the society are not going to bring in Quran and Hadith and so into their studies, but they need to bring morality back into the classroom. The whole society needs that change to get back on track with a moral perspective, that the students have a sense, have a moral compass, something they can hold on to be able to contribute positively to the development of South Africa. For Muslims, for the development of our communities in the context of South Africa. That we would produce those institutions which the rest of the society would be clamoring to join, because they know and have seen the product of moral-based education, Islamized curriculums and institutions. That this is a positive contribution to the future of South Africa. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We have students of all walks in life, particularly those black, with regards to the definition that I just provided, seemingly having a romantic attachment and a will to change the curriculum of our education system in South Africa, based on models that have happened in the past, and that's why Mahmoud Mamdani was there. What was interesting, however, many students stood up in the lecture, and one student said, how can it be ethical to pay outrageous bonuses to UCT executive members, and the senior management at UCT were awarded bonuses of 2.85 million rand. That's quite a bit of money. And they said, how can it be ethical to pay outrageous bonuses in the midst of impending financial exclusion of students? There's a lot of contradiction when it comes to this free education debate. You hire security that is worth 40 million rand, but you don't want to provide free education. And so there's a lot of irony and hypocrisy really at play. But the interesting language that is being used by the students at the forefront of the Fees Must Fall movement and the Roads Must Fall movement, decolonization, is, and they said, Dr. Max Price, you are morally bankrupt. You are unethical. That's an interesting word. And as Muslims, what is ethics? We have to understand that question, because when I got thrown off the bus, that wasn't very ethical to me, And so when I question my commitment to decolonization, and we'll get into the definition of that, first of all, I feel very nervous when it comes to the ethics of that. I don't like swearing. Foul language is not my taste, my cup of tea, so I don't often do that, but these people often do that. And so it's out there. We are faced with the situation of decolonization, and it's up to us as young people to understand it, because it's our future. And either that future is going to be shaped for us by people who are leading it now, or we can have a say in shaping how we want our own education system and the education system of our children to be in the future. if you don't really understand why decolonization is a problem, or at least colonization and coloniality is a problem, let me give you an example. The head of department, or like the former head of department that was before this year's head of department of politics at UCT, Anthony Butler and David Glazer at Wits University, they believe that apartheid is completely democratic, and when 1994 happened, it was simply a country that became more democratic. They say that Plato and those people didn't allow women to, saw women as half human, but there was still a democratic society, and so whites could vote, blacks couldn't. When blacks could, it became a more democratic society. That is really very funny if you think about it. So they are defending, up to this day, apartheid, and they are defending colonization. Alan Ziller, right, saying that colonialism has given us so much things. What could these poor black women do before there were baths and before there were these things to clean ourselves? That is very, very outwardly racist. And so that's the current context with which we find ourselves in. And we have to ask ourselves as Muslims, what are we doing and about this, and what is our future? What does our future look like? So Zubair Osman, who invited me, gave me a very nice overview of what I'm going to speak about. First thing is, what is decoloniality, right? Or what is this word? What does it mean? Now, we all know colonization, there were various moments of colonization and periods starting, from since time immemorial, including the Roman colonization of North Africa and West and parts of Asia and parts of Europe. But really, the age of discovery started in the 15th century, and this was when the Portuguese, Vasco da Gama and all of these people, and the Spanish went out and they discovered new lands, Christopher Columbus and all of these people, and then followed by the Dutch and the British and the French, Dutch East Indian Company, which brought a lot of the Malay slaves from Java to Cape Town and to other parts of the world. And so that's the context, that's the start of colonization. And what colonization means, it refers to an ongoing process of control by which a central system of power spreads into a surrounding land and takes control of its resources. So colonialism refers to the establishment, exploitation, and the maintenance and the acquisition, and of course expansion of a colony in one territory by political power from another territory. So we understand what that is, colonization. But also importantly, there is an unequal relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, right? And I'm actually colonizing your mind at the moment. So I'm the colonizer and you're the colonized. So there's an unequal relationship. But what I'm going to show you is that that unequal relationship is actually constructed by the colonizers themselves. So that's colonization and that's colonialism. Decolonization means removing that. Removing something. So basically removing the physical colonies by reinstating the former people. One of the examples of that is expropriation of land that is currently being spoken about. Land, you claim your land, people were removed from District 6. And the original sin, as Ramaphosa calls it, was of course when the colonialists took land from the African indigenous, the Khoisan. And so expropriation of land without compensation is simply doing exactly what they did in the first place, isn't it so? And so that's colonization, and it's a pity I don't have a slide to just demonstrate this, but if you can understand. Then we come to coloniality. So colonization is one thing, decolonization is another thing, and then we get coloniality. Coloniality is an abstract concept. It's not physical. We can't really see what's happening. Coloniality, for example, is more social and economic and intellectual. An example of the economic coloniality that we currently have is that even though colonization has ended outwardly, South Africans, our staple food, many of the people in South Africa, staple food is wheat, but we don't produce wheat. So have become dependent on countries that produce wheat. We produce sugar, but that's not our staple diet. That's an example of a economic, dependence. Decoloniality, therefore, is breaking down those constructs that are intellectual and abstract and social. Okay, and the craze with the Kardashians is an example of coloniality at its finest, even though it's recent. But that's simply a form of what has been taking place with different names over many, many centuries. And so that's an important thing to understand. Now we come to the constructs of, at least the answers to colonization and coloniality that have been put forward by scholars of decoloniality, including Mahmoud Mamdani that I mentioned earlier. And to them, it's really universality as pluriversality, which means to engage everyone, to bring everyone forward, and to have an equal playing field, and to have a new found of humanism, which means everyone is the same, everyone has the same values, everyone has equality. Liberalism includes everyone, including people who are homosexual, including people who, in some countries of the world, pedophilia is seen as not that bad, even though in the law it's something that's wrong. That's the truth, isn't it so? And incest as well, between brothers and sisters and those things. And so that is really the philosophy behind the majority of decolonial projects that we find in the world today. I'm just giving an overview of what I wrote down here, but what is important to understand in terms of what they are saying is that the thesis, the current status quo, is coloniality. The antithesis is decoloniality, that which we must oppose it with. And when all is said and done, the utopia, the synthesis, is receptive generosity, for us to understand each other on an equal playing field. لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. That's the Quranic injunction. So the goal is correct, and we all understand that the goal of decolonization is a good one, but are we going to justify the means simply by that end? And so that's when we have to ask ourselves the question, what is our participation as Muslims, right? Anyway, I'm laughing to myself because I remember Trevor Noah saying when he said participation in one of his stand-up comedy, he said party, and everyone was having a craze and he said participation, right? Anyway, that's a winning joke. Anyway, so there's certainly a conventional feeling among Muslims that Islam is based on the benefits of all human beings and we should learn from each other. But that journey is multifaceted. When I say Islamic decoloniality, I can't say Salafi Islam, can't say Sufi Islam, I can't say Shia Islam, I can't say Sunni Islam, I'm saying Islam. Because if we're going to differ just about what Islam is, then we're never going to come to decoloniality, right? So the simple thing is unity among the diversity. I have my opinion, you have your opinion, we all have our teachers that are connected to the best teacher, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we go forward with a common goal. However, it's important to understand that Islam is not simply a political movement. Islam is not a civilization, it's not a language. When people say, do you speak Islam, right? These Muslims, right? It's not a language. It's not simply a tradition or habits that people had in the past. But Islam is a deen, right? It's a deen. Sharia, it's a millah. And deen is dain, right? It's debt. So we are indebted to Allah for what we have. The ability to breathe, the ability to be alive. According to Imam Junaid al-Baghdadi, that shukr, gratitude, is simply doing what you're supposed to do with the limbs that you've been given. Right? So that is simply Islam, to do things according to what Allah wants. The main hadith, the most famous hadith that we learn in the beginning, and it's the second hadith of Imam Nawawi's 40 hadith, is Hadith Jibril. That is really the understanding of what our deen is. Mal Islam, mal Iman, mal Ihsan, wa ma alamat as-sa'a. Right? Those four main things. Really it's three, and then the fourth is really the context through which everyone understands their particular age. So Jibril comes to the Prophet ﷺ, and he asks, Mal Islam? And the Prophet ﷺ says, أن تشهد أن لا إله إلا الله تقيم الصلاة وتؤتي الزكاة وتصوم رمضان تحج البيت من استطاع إليه السبيل. The 5 pillars, we know it: Shahada, Salah, Zakah, fasting, and Hajj. Now, what is that? If you think about it relating to the human being, everyone knows that is all done without outward action, right? That's simply something that is done without outward action. So it's related to our body. صدقت, he says, right? And فتعجب الصحابة. They were amazed at how this person was asking the Prophet. And then he says, وَمَا الْإِيمَانِ? What is Iman? And he says, أن تؤمنوا بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر والقدر خير وشر من الله تعالى. That what is Iman? To believe in Allah, the Malaika, the Kutub, the books, and the messengers. All of these things are really abstract. Well, they're realities, but they're not physical realities. Allah is not a human being. The Malaika are made of nur in the Quran, it's clear. And the Quran, when you say the Quran is Kalamullah, what we have in front of us, when Zubair is Hafiz, right? Does he have a part of Allah in him? No. It's simply, my time up? Okay. Does he have a part of Allah in him? No, that's not the case. So the Quran is uncreated in its meaning, but when it comes to our books, it's Mus'haf. That's not Quran. And so it's the Quran in terms of Iman, it's abstract, right? And the messengers, sure, they came in reality, but our belief in them is also abstract. And then also when it comes to the Qadr, how do we understand that? We have free will, you know? So that is related to the mind, what we believe. And then Ihsan. أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك. You worship Allah as though you see Him. And if you don't see Him, know that He sees you. So there's the 5 pillars of Islam related to what we do, the body. 6 pillars of Iman relating to what we believe. And the 2 pillars of Ihsan, which is Muraqaba and Mushahada, to witness Allah, to see Allah, and to know that Allah sees you. What does seeing Allah mean? Seeing Allah mean physically? No. Seeing Allah means to witness Allah in terms of what we see in our lives. We know that that comes from Allah. So that's really an understanding of Islam. And then it comes to what are the alamat as-sa'a. And those are, as mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ too. And there are many more that he mentioned in other hadith. أن تلد أمة ربتها وأن ترى الحفاة العراة العالة يتطاولون في البنيان, right? So you'll see the mistress giving birth to her master, and the bare-footed naked shepherds competing in constructing and building skyscrapers, tall buildings. Some of the signs of the end of times. Now, these interpretations of what that means, some people say that the first one means the inversion of the education system, that the mistress will give birth to the master. There's a loss of respect between teacher and the student. We know that at our current universities. You come into the university today, you'll see someone putting their legs up and drinking a Coke, and the lecturer is speaking. in traditional societies, Islamic societies, there's adab, right? To put وضع الشيء في محله, to put things in its correct place. You'll see the student sitting humbly in front of the teacher, ready to learn with his ear and his eye and his heart. And so that's important to understand. That is Islam. Now, traditionally, when you talk about Islamic decoloniality now, we have to understand what Islam is as a holistic package, not simply as what we believe only, but what we believe, what we do, and ihsan, which is spirituality, tazkiyatun nafs, right? And people would call it many things. So Islam used to be called, at least what we believe, fiqh, right? That which is jurisprudence. Aqidah was iman, the beliefs in the various aspects of Islam. And then ihsan used to be called tasawwuf. And I'm not talking about Sufism, I'm talking about tasawwuf. There's a difference. What tasawwuf really is the purification of the heart. And it's essential to Islam because the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يقضي القاضي وهو غضبان. Right? The qadi cannot give a judgment, the judge cannot give a judgment while he's angry. If the room was too hot, too warm, the judge would have to leave and come back when it's cooler, because under that temperature, if you were to give a judgment, it could harm the person who gave the judgment to. If he had an argument with his wife before that, or then it definitely affect his judgment. And so, as part of Islam, when we make even fatwa, we have to exclude emotions, and we have to be in control of our emotions. If you're going to present Islam in a way as a representative of Rasulullah ﷺ, who was the kana ahlamun nas, he was the most forbidden, like he had forbearance, he had patience. If you're going to present Islam like that in public, then in fact you're misrepresenting Rasulullah ﷺ and you're misrepresenting Islam. And that's the point, that Islamic ethics, when we talk about Islamic ethics that is underpinning our understanding of Islamic decoloniality, Islamic ethics is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that is something that we have to understand. That Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ وَقُرْآنْ يَمْشِي بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. His character was the Qur'an. And he was like he was a living Qur'an walking among mankind. He would encourage the good and prevent the evil, and all of the other themes of the Qur'an. And so in order for us to understand how to approach anything in life, we have to understand that the prime example is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And, in terms of his engagement with people, and in terms of how he dealt with the things in his life and those around him, it was remarkable. The Prophet ﷺ, for example, when he came to Medina after the Hijrah, there were multiple ghazawat, right? There were multiple battles. The Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, the Ahzab, trenches, etc., etc. But the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تتمنى لقاء العدو أو كما قال, never desire to meet your enemies on the battlefield. That's what the Prophet ﷺ said. Now, what I notice among many of the people vying for revolution is really revolutionaries can't build that which they can so easily destroy. Isn't it so? So they can say this is wrong with our education system, this is wrong with the people in charge, but what are they going to put in its place? And revolutions have always been bloody. But when it comes to how we understand the jihad that was purported by the Prophet ﷺ, it's different to harb. Jihad and harb is different. Harb is war. Jihad is for peace and to a'la kalimatullah, to raise the word of Allah. And Badr, it happened outside of Medina. Uhud happened closer to Medina, and Ahzab happened in Medina. What does that tell us? That the wars were not offensive, but they were defensive, right? It came closer to the Prophet ﷺ as the different battles progressed. The Prophet didn't go out to kill people. In fact, when he came into Mecca, Fath Mecca, when he opened Mecca again, he says, اذهب فأنتم الحر من دخل بيت أبي سفيان كان آمنا. That go because you're all free. Those people persecuted him for 23 years, right? And Abu Sufyan, who became Muslim, but was one of the main enemies of Rasulullah ﷺ for that duration of time since he proclaimed Nubuwwah, he said whoever enters his home is safe. Now I want to ask the question, if we are going to adopt the ethics that many of these people have, or the ethics of Islamist groups that are against the very essence of Islam, which is that holistic package of the mind, body and the soul, the ruh, tazkiyah,